Hello to all logging in. Thank you for joining us for today's Grow Native webinar on the topic of moths, butterflies, and bees in the winter season. Before we continue, and while others join us, I want to extend a huge thank you to all of our program sponsors for the past year. You can view all of them on the slide here. And if you are interested in renewing or becoming a Grow Native professional member or sponsor in 2026, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link in the chat. And let me make sure it's going to everyone. And you can go ahead and look at what Grow Native membership is all about. And you can also visit grownative.org and click membership. We'll get started in just a moment. All right, it looks like we're ready to begin. Good afternoon, and welcome to our Grow Native webinar, Overwintering Habits of Moths, Butterflies, and Bees, with Chris Hartley of the Sophia M. Sachs Butterfly House. My name is Amanda Lance Ramrup, and I am the Events and Communications Coordinator for the Missouri Prairie Foundation and our 25-year-old Grow Native program. Thank you for joining us for the next webinar in our 2025 series. Our program begins with a presentation from Chris, followed by the Q&A session facilitated by Lily Germeroff, MPF's Conservation Program Associate. Throughout the next hour, we invite listeners to please type your questions for Chris in the Q&A section of your Zoom screen, which you will find at the bar at the bottom of your Zoom window. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow, along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. I'll hop back on to wrap everything up near the top of the hour. Now for more on our presenter. Chris is the Manager of Living Collections, Education, and Facilities at the Sophia M. Sachs Butterfly House. Raised in Georgia, Chris eventually attended the University of Georgia, where he earned a master's in entomology. He quickly acquired a love for education and started the Butterfly House nearly 20 years ago in August 2006. Chris worked as an entomologist in the education department before his present role. Day-to-day work includes the supervision of care for the living arthropod collection, tropical and native plants, and oversight of the education team. He coordinates interpretation volunteers and helps mentor the MANTIS program, which is for teen volunteers age 14 and up. And with that, I'll turn things over to you, Chris, for your presentation. Thank you so much for joining us.
No, and thank you for inviting me. So, I appreciate having the opportunity to talk to everyone about this topic. As Amanda was saying in my introduction, I have loved arthropods my whole life, and as I've worked through my professional career, I've gained an equally deep appreciation for plants, especially the native plants that are so important to the wildlife and to everything else that lives around us. And in this presentation, we're going to really focus in on overwintering habits of some common insects. If you have any other questions about anything not specifically mentioned in this presentation, go ahead and slip that into the Q&A. I will do my best to answer any and all questions that you all have. But I thought we would start with the mission of the Missouri Botanical Garden, which is part of my organization, the Butterfly House. We are a division of the Missouri Botanical Garden. And one of the missions of the garden and of the Butterfly House is to share knowledge about plants and their environment. And here at the Butterfly House, whenever we talk about the bugs that we speak about, we always take care to talk about their environment. For example, many people have now been taught to raise milkweed for monarch butterflies. And the number of people who tell us that they've been growing the milkweed for monarchs, but it has these awful bugs on it and they just need to get rid of them. Well, we try to educate people that those aphids or milkweed bugs or whatever they might be seeing, milkweed tussock moth caterpillars are fine to have there because it's a community, it's the environment, it's everything around it. And unless it's an exotic invasive pest, it all belongs. That's what we'll be talking about when we talk about overwintering today as well. So let's get all on the same page about what we're talking about when we're talking about overwintering. So here's a definition of it, but basically we're talking about the process by which living things wait out the winter. A deciduous tree overwinters by dropping all of its leaves and going dormant. Quite a lot of mammals overwinter by hibernating. Now, insects have some remarkable overwintering strategies. They're not technically, if you want to get picky with definitions, they're not really defined as hibernating, though I'll often use that word in conversation just because it's a familiar term. But it's more properly called overwintering, and it usually involves a slowing down of metabolic processes, as these animals will often thicken their blood through some really remarkable physiological processes so that ice crystals won't form in their bodies. And they are able just to go quiet and still, halt their development, and wait through the winter. What we're going to be talking about today are some specific strategies that are all a little bit different depending on the kind of animal that we're talking about. But insects will actually go through the overwintering at different points in their life cycle. And you've probably heard of metamorphosis before, and maybe of complete versus incomplete metamorphosis. Complete metamorphosis is the butterfly life cycle that includes four stages: the eggs, larva, pupa, and adult. In this image, you can see the butterfly life cycle on the left and a honeybee life cycle on the right, just to show that bees and butterflies all go through the same process. So do beetles, so do flies, so do ants, so do wasps. They all go through a complete metamorphosis. And we're going to be talking, especially as we get into the butterflies and moths, that some will overwinter in the pupa stage, some will overwinter in the caterpillar stage. Even some butterflies overwinter as adult butterflies. And this, the way the life cycle is kind of broken up into these different stages, kind of allows the different animals to occupy their own niche during hibernation or overwintering. It allows them to find their own place in the ecosystem where they can go to not face extensive competition from their neighbors and to survive in their own way. The first thing I want to look at you all with is bees before we get into butterflies and moths. So one thing that you may or may not have heard before is that there's about 450 native bee species here where I live in Missouri. And over the course of the country, there's thousands of bee species. Their nesting habits are something that some people know a little bit about, some people may not realize is quite this extensive. If we think about bees in general, 70% of them nest underground. And you can see an example of kind of what those looks like in the top photo here. They often look like ant hills. I'll be talking more about this in just a second once we get into the various bee groups. But the remaining number of them nest inside stem cavities or other cavities. These are often referred to as twig or stem nesting bees. But these bees also might make use of holes that have been pre-drilled in wood by birds or other or bark beetles or other animals. Basically, they'll use any kind of cavity which they can go in and line that cavity with whatever material their group uses to construct its nest. This little image here on this slide shows some of the variety of building materials that these cavity nesting bees will use. Some will actually cut pieces of leaf. Those are called the leaf cutter bees. Some will actually use fluff from fluffy plants, and they'll use that to pack their nests with. Some will use mud. Those are called mason bees. And some will actually use resins and other substances produced by their body that they'll plug the tubes with. Since there are so many of them, we're going to start by looking at the ground-dwelling bees. So bumblebees are one of the most familiar types of bees. that there are. And bumblebees are a colonial bee species. The vast majority of bees that I'm going to be talking about with you all this afternoon are solitary bees. The other colonial bee that you've surely heard of is the honeybee. But bumblebees, as you can see in the bottom photo here on this slide, do live in colonies that can have hundreds or maybe even 1,000 individuals. These colonies will typically be made underground, usually in a pre-existing burrow, like maybe an abandoned rodent nest. They might also be at ground level, where they would be covered by brush or debris, or perhaps a pile of stones or a pile of brush or something like that. In other words, these bees need shelter. They won't be like up in a tree or something like that, but they can use a great variety of kind of shelters to achieve that. Now, there are commercial bumblebee nests that you can purchase, and you can easily find those with a quick Google search. In my experience, and from what I've heard from at other presentations, those can not be very effective at actually getting bees to nest in them. Queen bumblebees tend to be very, very picky about where they select their nest. And more often than not, those artificial nests just don't seem to be what they're looking for. But in terms of providing habitat for bumblebees in your yard, um, one of the main things that I'm going to return to at the end of this presentation is kind of the whole idea of leaving the leaves and maintaining natural habitat. As long as you are maintaining a yard that has some natural habitat that these insects can look for and find naturally, that's going to be what they prefer more than an artificial nest box anyway. We will be getting, when we get to the stem nesting bees, with a way that you actually can provide some habitat in your yard if you're looking to actually intentionally provide nesting boxes and things like that. One neat thing about bumblebees is that they are pollinators in poor weather. They're also very, and I should clarify, by poor weather, what I mean is when it's too cold or wet for other bees to really be active. Most notably, these bees are able to be active in cool weather when honeybees typically stay inside their hive. They're also incredibly important pollinators for some beloved fruits and vegetables, namely tomatoes, chili peppers, eggplants, and some berries, especially things like blueberries, where honeybees really can't pollinate those plants at all. Bumblebees are the primary pollinators of those. Here are the other ground-dwelling bees that are commonly seen in North America. There's a diverse assemblage of them. The mining bees, got their name because they will make these multi-branched tunnels down into the ground that could actually go many, many feet down into the ground. Most sweat bees are going to be ground nesting bees. And many people have the understanding that sweat bees are stinging bees. And while it is definitely true that especially the larger ones are capable of stinging people, people really have nothing to fear from sweat bees stinging. One thing I learned here during my time at the butterfly house and just conversation with people is that the common name sweat bee seems to be applied, at least in my part of the country, to some wasps, notably yellow jackets. That really impressed me when I heard that. And I was like, well, if you're confusing them for yellow jackets, yes, no wonder you think they can sting. But I've also heard some people tell me that true sweat bees can sting too. So, like I was saying, while it's definitely possible that such a thing could happen, I find that all of the bees in this list and bumblebees as well are incredibly docile, not aggressive at all. The cellophane bees are a really interesting kind of bee that when they're lining their nests, they use a secretion made by glands on their body that when it dries, it looks very much like cellophane. Digger bees and longhorn bees are actually in the same family as honeybees and bumblebees. And With a name like digger bees, I'm sure you can imagine they do a good job of digging. Longhorn bees typically make straight tunnels down into the ground. And the hibiscus turret bee, I have an image of it there. They're ground nesting bees that are usually very recognizable because if you see their holes, they'll have this little cylindrical mud turret at the opening. And that is very, very recognizable as their work. The hibiscus turret bee is a specialist on hibiscus plants, as you might guess from its name. But in general, all of these ground dwelling bees will make use of areas that could be kind of in and amongst grass. You can see that in the cellophane bee aggregation photos. They might also, depending on the species, prefer more bare, sandy soil. That seems to be the case with most of the mining bees. And you might have some of these in your yard. If you do have some holes that kind of resemble ant nests, and you don't see a lot of ant activity there, those could very well be ground bee nests. They can be pretty hard to distinguish from ant hills just looking at them. But the one thing that is almost always true about active ant nests, at least, is that they will have ants constantly pouring in and out. So that's usually a pretty good way to tell if it is an ant nest. All of these bees are solitary bees, as I was mentioning on the bumblebee slide. And as solitary bees, that means one female bee does all of the provisioning of these nests. She doesn't have a bunch of sisters helping her out. She's doing it all on her own. The males are not involved at all once they mate with the female. The female will just make repeated trips in and out to gather pollen, bring it back, load the nest, go out to get more pollen, and repeat. So the reason I mention that is you might have one of these nests in your yard, but you might never see the bee that is actually building the nest. Your odds of seeing her do go up if you, of course, sit and watch for a prolonged period of time. But even then, you'd have to catch it at of course, the time when the adult is active, which is not going to be all year long. It's going to be a portion of the year. And many of these bees have a very limited activity window. Some of the mining bees, for example, are really known for only being active for maybe March and April, or March, April, and May, and then they're actually done for the whole rest of the year. The overwintering strategy here, since that's the topic of our talk, is all of these nests, all of these tunnels in the ground are where the overwintering happens. They're going to be provisioned with pollen balls, and they are going to have the either eggs or larvae in there passing the whole winter. And this then becomes important for us as caretakers of our property and gardeners, because if we, even by doing normal garden tasks, dig these up, then we will have destroyed a whole generation of these bees. So I think it's always good as people who are interested in this kind of stuff to kind of survey your yard and see if you might have some of these. And then you can be aware as you're doing your kind of yard tasks so that you don't accidentally damage them. So the cavity dwelling bees. So again, there's a list of the bees that are cavity dwelling bees. These are the leafcutter bees, the carpenter bees, small carpenter bees, mason bees, and yellow-faced bees. And I will mention that both of these lists on both of these slides are not all the bees I could be talking about. Of course, there's more. I'll start with the leafcutter bees, which are actually really interesting. So leafcutter bees are so named because they will fly off to trees or shrubs or other plants, and they will cut semicircles of leaf out of those plants. It's actually a very recognizable pattern. And if you've ever, noticed either in your yard or on a walk, if you've ever noticed a tree that has leaves that just look like someone has taken a hole puncher and punched half moons out of the edges, that was a leafcutter bee. They start at the edge, they cut a half moon shape, and they carry it off. And when they get back to their nest, as you can see at the bottom of this slide, they will actually roll those leaves up into cylinders, and they will line the inside of the tube or the cavity that they're nesting in with those leaf pieces. Now, in reality, that's not one continuous tube of leaves. What they'll actually do is they'll make a little packet with a back. They'll lay an egg in it. They'll provision it with pollen, and then they'll close that off. So if you ever open up a leafcutter bee nest, what you end up is like with a bunch of leaf pills in your hand. And each one of those contains a baby bee and all the provisions it will need to last through the winter. Now, in the case of carpenter bees, almost everyone's familiar with the large carpenter bee. And if you know it because it's a constant presence around your deck or siding or some other wood structure at your house. So the large carpenter bee, the female has incredibly powerful jaws and she can bore into wood. They're going to make their own cavity. And they will, of course, use a pre-existing cavity if there is one, but they're capable of just drilling into wood and setting up shop there. The small carpenter bee, on the other hand, is very small. There is a picture of it in that top picture there. You can see it boring into a standing plant stem. And the small carpenter bee is only about the size of your pinky fingernail. It's a very, very small bee. They're so small, in fact, many of these bees are on the small side, and you may not even notice that you have them in your yard until you look really, really closely at the flowers you have. But the small carpenter bee does not damage wooden structures. It prefers to nest in pithy plant stems. And I'll talk more about that near the end when we talk about leaving the stems in your garden. But you can see in this photo by Heather Holm that that's a stem that is standing upright in the ground. So like the bottom of it is still in the ground. It's just been broken off. And what these bees will do is they'll look for those hollow stems. And in the case of the small carpenter bee, they actually prefer ones that are still attached to the ground and pointing upright. And they will just dig the pith out of there and go down in there to make their nest. In the case of mason bees, they will actually seal off their tubes with mud that they pick up from the ground, hence the name mason bees. And with all of these cavity nesting bees, this is an area where people who care about wildlife and want to provide a home for it can actually provide a bee house. So we can use the mason bee tubes here as an example of kind of what that might look like, though there's lots of different models that you can do. You may have seen at a gift shop or a gardening store or something, bee houses available for sale. And these usually look like little wooden houses that have various things built into them. They often have some tubes, either some paper straws or some plant stems or something like that. That's great. That's the right idea. But it is very important if you decide you want to do this or give it a try to have tubes that are at least 6 inches long. 6 inches is kind of a magic number for these bees. They could be 7 inches, they could be 8 inches, at least 6 inches though. Because if you go any shorter than that, what happens is that it will skew the sex ratio of the next generation, and there will be more male bees born than female bees. And of course, if there's hardly any female bees around, it's hard for them all to successfully complete the next generation like they intend to. So my advice to people is always, while it might be tempting to just buy one off the shelf, really take a look at it before you bring it home to make sure it's at least 6 inches deep. If it's not, you're potentially causing more harm than good for your native bees. Luckily, it's very easy to make your own. You can take any container. It doesn't matter if it's a cylinder or a rectangle or whatever. I've seen people use old buckets or old flower pots that they didn't need anymore. I've seen people of course, you can build a frame out of wood. You can use literally any container. But once you have that container, you just stuff it full of hollow plant stems or paper straws, which you can buy, or you can use any kind of natural hollow material. So, like, you don't want to use plastic straws, for example. Plastic is just going to cause mold problems. But anything that is of a natural material or paper straws, hollow plant stems are going to be your best choice if you're not sure what to go for. And you just stuff them into that container, and that will become a bee home. There's a lot of great information about this. There's two sources that I'll mention right now, and we can mention them again later. But one is the photo of the small carpenter bee here is by Heather Holm, and she has some fantastic resources, both on the web and in print, about the topic of pollinators. And her site, Pollinators of Native Plants, provides all of this information and more about how you can create habitat for these bees and help them survive the winter by building homes like this. Another great habitat is the Xerces Society. That's Xerces, if you haven't heard of them before. They are the preeminent invertebrate conservation organization, and they have so many resources about building home for wildlife, creating safe overwintering habitat, and much more beside. But as with the ground nesting bees, once these bees have established their nests in their cavities, they're going to lay an egg in there, or in some cases, it's the larva, and the whole winter is passed inside these structures. Now, you may be thinking, but what about honeybees? So, honeybees are really, for many people, when you say bee, they will envision a honeybee. The fuzzy yellow body, the black stripes, the Cheerios mascot, right? That's a honeybee. But in so many ways, they are the least typical bee that we have in our fauna, and they're not native. The proper name for these bees is the European honeybee, and they were, in fact, brought over to North America by European settlers. They were never here before. And, that has, of course, a lot of interesting, you know, ramifications when you think about it. But they're weird because they have this colony. They have this big hive of thousands of individual bees, and no other North American bee does this. Bumblebees are the only other colonial bee that we have, and they don't have the same hive structure. Only the queen survives the winter in bumblebees. But in honeybees, they have a perennially active hive, which means that all of the workers survive the winter too. And when it's too cold to go outside, they just hang out inside the hive, and they huddle together in a bee ball, and they all vibrate their bodies to generate heat. But they are active year round, which is a crazy thing. If there's an especially warm day in January, you might actually see honeybees come out to forage and see if they could find something to bring back to the hive. So they are nothing like our other native bees in terms of social structure or overwintering habits. And of course, as a non-native bee, they have a lot of very valuable things to give us. They're crucial to our modern agriculture system. And of course, they provide honey. But they're definitely not to be confused with our native bees. And in fact, while I'm not about to say that honeybees aren't important, when people say in general, bees are disappearing, bees need our help, what you should be hearing is the bees that aren't honeybees need our help. Honeybees are a very secure species. Their importance to agriculture means that we can kind of never have enough for them, but they are certainly not endangered, whereas some of these others are teetering on the brink. Okay, so the overwintering story with bees is pretty simple. Even though they have these two different nest structures, they spend their winter inside some sort of nest. that's provisioned by the mother. With butterflies and moths, there are many various overwintering strategies, though, that are quite interesting. Most butterflies and moths will overwinter in the pupa stage, while some overwinter in the caterpillar stage too. I'll talk really quickly about how moth and butterfly pupal stages differ. Um, Thanks to Eric Carle and the Very Hungry Caterpillar, most kids have grown up understanding that the caterpillar makes a cocoon, but there is a definition for the cocoon that is pretty easy to spot, really. So the top photo here is a cocoon, and the bottom photo is a chrysalis. A cocoon is a silken structure or a mud structure or some other outer structure that is wrapped completely around the pupa while it's changing. So in the case of moths, they will actually spin a silken cocoon, and inside that silken cocoon, there is the pupa. And if I don't have an image of the inside of a cocoon here, but if you do cut one open and look inside, what you see looks an awful lot like the chrysalis, such as you see in the bottom photo there. So basically, a chrysalis is an exposed pupa, and what you're seeing when you see it is just the exoskeleton of the animal. A cocoon is a complete outer wrapping, like a sleeping bag, that the animal is inside and is completely enclosed in. There is no butterfly that will make a cocoon to wrap around itself. So butterflies always have a chrysalis. Many, if not most moths, do make the silken cocoon, but there are also some moths that will not. So there's no absolutes in nature. There's often exceptions, but anytime you do see a silken cocoon like that, you're definitely looking at some sort of moth. Though of course there are other animals like spiders that use silk too. If it's a pupa though, it's going to be a moth cocoon. Okay. So with that behind us, let's talk about the overwintering strategies of butterflies. It's good to start with the migrators. The monarch butterfly, of course, is a very famous migrating butterfly, and its overwintering strategy in North America is to not be here for winter. It goes to Mexico or to Florida or to Southern California. Monarchs west of the Rocky Mountains go to Southern California, and they will spend the winter there. Monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains will go down to central Mexico. They return to the same roosting sites high in the Mexican mountains every single winter. And it is now known, actually has been known for quite a while, that there are year-round populations of monarchs in Florida too, and some that inhabit the East Coast near the Atlantic Ocean seem to actually travel down to Florida when it gets too cold where they live. So the monarch is without a doubt the most famous migrator in the world of butterflies, but there actually are others. So the cloudless sulfur is the other butterfly that we know does some migration. If you live north of like the Gulf states, these butterflies cannot survive in winter. They definitely freeze out here in Missouri. So they do tend to come into our area in the north, and they will head back south in the fall. And that is really, really interesting. They don't go anywhere near the distance of the monarch butterfly, but the adult actually does complete a migration. The same can't really be said for some of these other butterflies. Is the common buckeye a migrating species here in Missouri? It's unsure. What we can say for sure is that these butterflies do not survive the winter here. They will come into our area every summer, and you typically see quite a lot of them by the end of summer, but they don't overwinter here in any way. They probably just get frozen back by the winter and survive year round in the southern states and then come back in the summer of the next year. The same for the painted lady. This is a very familiar butterfly to a lot of people because it's the one sold as classroom kits. So a lot of school kids have reared painted ladies. Again, it immigrates into Missouri and even all the way up to Canada every single summer and gets frozen back by the winter. But it probably does not migrate back and forth. So now let's talk about the ones that do spend the winter here. If it's not a monarch and it's not one of the other ones that I just talked about, it is staying here in some life stage and hunkering down and surviving the winter. The mourning cloak is a very interesting example of one that hibernates here because it will actually overwinter as an adult butterfly. They are incredibly cryptically colored, especially when they close their wings, and they will hide in nooks and crannies and rocks and bark, and they will just hibernate there. So this is one of the earliest butterflies that you'll see in most springs. The one caveat there is that you may not see one most anytime unless you really live near the woods. This is much more a butterfly of kind of woodland edges, if not in the woods itself. But it is one of our most glorious butterflies in terms of pattern, in my opinion. The whole group of swallowtail butterflies overwinters as pupae. And you may see their chrysalises on the sides of trees or even the sides of buildings or plant stems. They can go just about anywhere where in their little butterfly brains they feel safe. I'll run through some of the common swallowtails real quickly. This is the pipevine swallowtail butterfly, one of the most recognizable ones that we have for sure. They feed on pipevine, which is pretty much the only plant that they'll feed on. The black swallowtail butterfly. This, for many people, is one of the most commonly seen butterflies, or maybe the most commonly seen caterpillars, because the caterpillars will feed on dill, parsley, and fennel, in addition to the native plant golden Alexander. This is the eastern tiger swallowtail butterfly, which is also really recognizable when it's yellow. Sometimes these can be black, and they look a lot like some of the black swallowtails that I've been showing too. The one in the image here, of course, is the yellow form. But to picture a black one, imagine all the yellow replaced by black. It basically just looks like a black butterfly. Now, so the caterpillar goes through several different stages, first looking like a bird dropping, then kind of turning green. These will feed on several different trees, mainly tulip tree and black cherry and sweet bay magnolia seem to be the ones they prefer. And then there's the spice bush swallowtail butterfly. It also starts off its life looking like a bird dropping before becoming what most people call a snake mimic. Whether the caterpillar thinks it's trying to be a snake or not, who knows? But it definitely has some big fake eyes on itself. If you're a Pokemon fan, this is the inspiration for Caterpie, which I always like pointing out in my classes. And if you ever see one of these on a spice bush, you may also see them on sassafras. That's another host plant I'll use. They actually roll the leaves up like a taco. So they're pretty easy to spot on the plant because you'll find this one leaf that's just folded up in half for some reason. And if you open it up, you will see the little caterpillar inside. Okay. Transitioning from the swallowtails, there's a group of butterflies called the fritillaries, and they have an overwintering strategy that, if I'm being generous, you could call reckless. The way fritillaries overwinter is as a first instar larva, and the mother prepares them for the winter by laying the eggs wherever she feels like it on the forest floor. They feed on violets as caterpillars, but they actually won't eat anything until the spring. The first instar, if you're not familiar with the word instar, as insects grow and shed their skin, instar, it refers to the growth stages. So a just hatched caterpillar is the first instar. Then when it sheds its skin, it becomes its second instar, and so on until it becomes a pupa. So the first instar larva is teeny tiny, about the size of a hair from your eyebrow or smaller. It's just dropped on the forest floor by its mother. It immediately goes into overwintering. And then in the spring, hopefully violets grow where it is. And, that is basically their strategy. But luckily, violets are very, very common. And, um, I was being a little bit humorous, but, the mothers do frequent areas, of course, where violets are known to be, the areas where they've grown up from. But the fritillaries are one of the most common butterflies that we have in our flower gardens, especially the great spangled fritillary, which many of you have probably seen before, and the regal fritillary, which is a species of conservation concern in the state of Missouri. They're really, really beautiful. The regal fritillary are the ones on the bottom with this the really, really vibrant silver spots and the blue iridescence on their hind wings when they're sitting with their wings open. So the red spotted purple and the viceroy, these are in the same genus, the genus Limonitis. And if you look at the two pictures of them, the viceroy is very famous. It's the famous monarch mimic. The red spotted purple almost, well, does look nothing like it. And they are actually in the same genus of butterflies. They are the caterpillar, that is the caterpillar of a viceroy, but it really looks very, very similar to the caterpillar of the red spotted purple. Both viceroys and red spotted purples can be seen in our area. They feed primarily on willows as caterpillars, and they actually overwinter as a caterpillar. So what they will do is after feeding a little bit, they don't overwinter as young as the fritillaries do, but after feeding for a little bit, they will actually travel to the tip of a branch, find some leaves, and they will actually use silk to form a structure out of those leaves. And they will spend the whole winter inside that structure, even if it falls to the ground. It's called a hibernaculum, and that is their overwintering strategy. So one thing you're probably picking up on is that a lot of these animals will end up on the ground or under the ground or, in the leaves or something like that. That's going to be crucial to my concluding message about how we can help them survive in our yards. So just to touch on a few moths that are very common in people's experience, the Sphinx moths. This is a family of moths. They're often called the hornworms because their caterpillars are often very large caterpillars, and at the end of their body, they have a little spike or horn. They all overwinter as pupae, and that usually happens underground. That makes these kind of challenging to rear compared to many butterflies because you actually have to provide them with several inches of soft soil that they can dig into. And sometimes you might be digging in your garden and you might turn up something that looks like this giant chestnut brown creature. Oftentimes they have a really bizarre kind of trunk. That would just be their antenna and proboscis developing. Well, that's a hornworm pupa. That's a sphinx moth pupa that you have just dug up out of your yard. And the best advice I could give you would be to rebury it and let it become a moth in the spring. So there's about 125 species of sphinx moth in North America. Many of them are well known to people because they fly around like hummingbirds and visit flowers. And it's a really cool sight to see. You can usually tell if you get more than a second's look that it's not actually a hummingbird, but they move exactly like them. So what's pictured here are some common ones that I've actually photographed right here around the butterfly house. So there's some with clear wings, there's some with striped wings, there are big ones and small ones, and they're really a fantastic group of moths. Perhaps not as fantastic to most people, though, as the giant silk moths or the giant silkworm moths. So these are the largest moths in North America, the largest moths in the world. The gigantic Atlas moth that you may have seen if you visit us here at the Butterfly House before, from Asia. The largest moth in the world that can have a 12-inch wingspan is a member of this family. But here in our state, we have a couple. I'll be showing you some on the next slide. Here on this slide, we have the glorious Luna moth that, many people would say is probably their favorite moth and most beautiful moth. It's definitely up there with me too. All of these giant silk moths overwinter as a pupa. They will usually, when the caterpillar transforms, it will still be up on the tree. So it will actually weave some leaves into its silken cocoon. It's very common to have leaves actually be a part of its silken cocoon. And then when the trees drop their leaves for the winter, down comes the cocoon. And it's perfectly camouflaged to look like the dead leaves or other things on the ground. So here are some of the silk moths that call our area home, and this isn't all of them, not by far. So the lovely yellow guy with the big blue eyes is the Io moth. The one right below it that's yellow and brown splotched is the imperial moth. My favorite, which is the burnt orange one with the yellow spots on the gray wings, that is the regal moth or the royal walnut moth. It is a fantastic thing to behold. And the one at the bottom with the wings spread is the Polyphemus moth. Many, many people have probably seen some of these. Usually you will see them in the morning. When you first go outside, you might see one sitting on the side of your house or a door or something like that. It is incredibly rare to actually see them when they're active at night because they're up in the trees, they're finding mates, they're strictly nocturnal, usually in the middle of the night. But they do get attracted to lights, like many moths do, and that's how most of us see them. A couple of other moths that are really well known. The name for this fellow is the Isabella tiger moth, but you probably know it as the woolly bear caterpillar. So the woolly bear is probably one of the most famous caterpillars, and it actually spends the winter as a larva. In fact, the reason why we see so many woolly bear caterpillars crawling around on the ground right, it's probably a little too late now in November, but right during fall time is because they are looking for a place to burrow under the leaves or maybe under an inch or so of soil and spend the winter. They're going to come out of the ground in March or April and transform into a moth. Another common tiger moth around here is the Virginia tiger moth, sometimes called the yellow bear, as opposed to the woolly bear. But they are very, 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 very common, even if you haven't seen one. They look a lot like a woolly bear, but they don't have the distinctive rusty red and black segments to their body. And they actually overwinter as a pupa. So the strategies are a little bit different, even within the plant, even within the moth families. Now, since you're attending a conservation talk and are eager to learn more about this, many of you may be aware that the news about butterfly and moth diversity and bee diversity and insect diversity in general is pretty dire. This particular study that's being referenced here was one of the most convicting from the past recent period of time. It quotes a decline of 22% of our total abundance of butterflies from the 20 years, 2000 to 2020. And, it can be very easy to get discouraged by things like this. I find it sometimes very depressing, for sure. But, here at my job at the Butterfly House, one thing that I get to do is to tell people how you can make a difference. And one reason why there's been such a dramatic decline in insect diversity has to do with habitat loss. Okay. And habitat means so many different things. It absolutely means planting blooming flowers for them to, lay eggs on and raise caterpillars, or for bees to feed from. It absolutely means, limited use of insecticides and things like that. all those things are very important. But when you talk about overwintering, you could do everything. You could have a beautiful wildlife habitat in your yard. But if you don't understand how these insects overwinter, you might inadvertently, destroy a whole generation. So, 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 we have drawn on inspiration from the Xerces Society, who is someone I mentioned before. And one of their big campaigns, Leave the Leaves, that's actually language they came up with. And I encourage you all to look up Xerces Society, Leave the Leaves, to learn a whole lot more about this. But in short, the do's and don'ts are you want to leave the leaves like they are. The leaves are a natural habitat for these animals to live in. Everything from ground nesting bees to bumblebee queens to butterfly chrysalids. I talked about how the moth cocoons fall out of the trees and land on the leaves, or the woolly bears burrow underground. Fireflies have to complete a multi-year life cycle in the leaves. Ladybugs overwinter on the ground. You can list so many things that really depend on a blanket of leaves. So some of the big don'ts are don't bag up your leaves and let a truck take them away. It's advisable not to mow them. That's not the worst thing you could do, just to be honest with everyone. But the reason they say don't mow them is because one of the reasons the leaves are so effective for these animals is that they are kind of like an insulating blanket, and they're most effective as an insulating blanket when they're whole. I will say, for many people, especially those of us who have neighborhood obligations and other such obligations to keep a really tidy yard, may need to engage in some leaf mowing, but maybe you could then use that leaf mowing as a mulch on your planting beds, which is what I'd recommend for the entire leaves too. You don't have to leave the leaves exactly where they fall. You could leave the leaves but move them first. And what I mean by that is, if you have a lot of leaves falling in your yard, could you rake them into an area around the trees, as in that top right photo? Can we intentionally use the leaves in place of bark mulch or pine bark mulch? Can we just change the way we think about our lawn care so that we establish areas where the leaves are going to be intentionally collected so that our yards look nice and orderly and everything looks as it should? Nothing looks like we just don't care about our yards, but we're providing that habitat, and we are, doing it in the way that we know that has been best supported as being most effective for these animals. So we want to leave the leaves, as this says, for them. And it isn't just the animals that we've been talking about today. Roly-polies, millipedes, the firefly one surprises a lot of people. Fireflies have to have, in some species, more than 1 year in the larva stage to be able to successfully grow up into fireflies. In the case of fireflies, they feed on snails and slugs, and those animals prefer moist habitats. So the leaf litter habitat is just the perfect place for fireflies to be. And many people, comment to me casually that they aren't seeing as many fireflies as they used to. It's because of habitat loss. It's because the land we live in now, and the suburban urban ecosystem is not hospitable to them anymore. There's other factors too, for sure, like chemical use and such like that. But again, you can make a difference. You can provide that habitat that they need and probably see a lot more insect life around your house. And you can leave the stems too. I did talk about how a lot of bees are cavity nesting bees. So this graphic kind of shows what leaving the stems might look like. So oops, I'm sorry. Can I go back? I want to go back. There we go. So basically what leaving the stems looks like is in winter, you don't do anything. You're going to leave dead flower stalks intact over the winter. And then in spring, you want to cut back the dead flower stalks, but you want to leave standing stems up to 24 inches. Here at the Butterfly House, we usually go for about a foot to a foot and a half. And the female bees will find that. They will lay their eggs in there and start their next life cycle. You've provided the habitat. And by summer, the new growth has grown up and your garden looks beautiful. Those standing plant stems that you left are totally hidden behind the new growth. And then, of course, in fall, winter, you prevent. Now, the reason you cut the things back in spring is because the bees are overwintering inside the plant stems. You really don't want to do any cutting back until spring. And then, of course, seasonal blooms too. It would be wrong of me not to mention that part of providing proper habitat is the seasons that aren't winter too. And when I talk to people about providing nectar and other food, make sure you cover every month of the year. And you can. You can get plants that bloom as early as March. You can get plants that bloom in November. There is a New England asters still in bloom in my yard and here at the Butterfly House. So try to cover plants that bloom in every season of the year. And with that, I would like to thank everyone, and I would definitely love to take questions.
Great, Chris. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and begin with some stem nesting bee questions, both that trickled in at the beginning, but related to your points on leaving stems. We will circulate instruction and recommendation from the Xerces Society on how to establish this habitat, information on maybe how high off the ground and the orientation, but there were multiple questions about, is it too late to put these out now? Do you have any specific recommendations on placement that you can share with us?
For sure. And I would definitely just re-echo everything you said. I think the detail in those Xerces resources and other resources is just there's so much more detail in those than I could give off the top of my head. So please do consult those. But basically, bees are going to be looking for these habitats in the spring. So there's nothing wrong with putting them out now. You're not going to get any sort of takers until the spring. But in fact, putting them out now may not be such a bad idea, because if you're anything like me, when we get that spring fever and start getting outside, we might forget to put them out. But for sure, you want to probably put them out before March comes. So put them out now, put them out in February, but have them out long before that last frost so that the early season bees that do come out would have it available. As far as orientation, you typically want the openings facing south. Most of the resources I've read say southeast. So, because as the summer gets on and the days are longer, that western sky, you can just get really, really pounding sun. But I think any south-facing direction would be adequate. And the reason for my hesitation is certainly I am not a bee biology expert per se, but I think any southerly direction is the preferred direction.
Great, thank you so much. We had related questions of, I found a great spot for this cavity that I put out, or maybe I've noticed bees here in the past, but I'm not seeing them now. One, maybe you can speak on year-to-year observations of bees in the same place, and speak on if they reuse nests from year to year.
Yeah, I don't know if the questioner was specifically mentioning like nest boxes or nest tubes they've had out, but you
Yes,
do need to
specifically boxes. Yeah.
Okay, so you do need to do some maintenance on those. Once a tube has been used, it won't necessarily be used again. by the bees. So quite a lot of people will actually, even if they have, say they have a wooden box with holes drilled into it, they'll go ahead and put straws into those holes because you can take those out each year and put new straws in. Um, Bee blocks with drilled holes are pretty much one-time use only because once the bees fill them up, bees next year aren't going to use those. But you can also, if you do something like the bucket that you stuff plant stems into, you want to get new plant stems for the subsequent year. So people then usually wonder, well, what do I do with the ones that I take out? You're going to want to find an out of the way spot where you don't mind just kind of piling them on the ground, at least until summer comes. Excuse me. Because um, until spring really gets going, you don't know for sure that all those bees haven't emerged from their pupa and come out. So if the goal is to have nesting sites available in March, which I would say is the time to aim for, what you want to do if you have one of these habitats set up and want to reuse it, you're going to want to take those tubes out, put it in, as long as you don't put it inside. You never take them inside because that'll screw everything up temperature wise. But you can put it in the corner of your yard you're not looking at, or into a separate container for that purpose or something like that, and just wait for the bees to come out, and then you can go ahead and reload that nesting block with new tubes.
Excellent, thank you. We had one interesting question or many interesting questions, but this is regarding the hollow stems. There are the intentional nest boxes that we're putting out that have the stems oriented horizontally. Theoretically, I think is how most people are orienting them, but the standing stems are vertical. Do you have any thoughts on how orientation or gravity might be playing on the development of the insect?
Different bee species will prefer different orientations. So the reason for the standing stems is that some bees, like the small carpenter bees, they really look for that and are known to need that. And many of the bees that we're providing like the horizontal stems for, in nature, they may not be using stems nearly as much as they would be using holes in trees made by bark beetles or woodpeckers or things like that. And we're kind of mimicking that. But really, to provide the most habitat possible, you kind of want both.
Great, thank you. Question asker wonders, is there a type of wood that the carpenter bee prefers? Is there a type of wood that the carpenter bee will not burrow into? Do you have any thoughts here?
Honestly, I don't really know the answer to that. They seem to be able to make use of most wood. I don't really know if they prefer one kind of wood over another. Um, the carpenter bee question is one that we certainly get asked a lot because they can be destructive. I would recommend that you kind of consult with like an extension service or maybe someone who probably has a lot more information about that. They might be able to tell you. I would imagine, and I will say this is just my own imagining, that the more pressure treated, like, more treated hardwoods are probably the best ones to prevent them. But I'm pretty sure that they will even make use of those if it's what's available.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
Now we can shift to some butterfly questions. One attendee asked about the painted lady, how if it does not migrate and it freezes out in the winter, how does it survive? Can you speak more to what that
Yeah.
dynamic is?
Yep. For the painted lady and the buckeye, they don't freeze out in the southern states. They survive year round in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. And what happens here and all the way up into Canada is that as soon as the weather is above freezing, they are off. And they're not trying to go north. It's not an intentional, oh, let's go north, everybody. But they're finding their food plants, they're spreading out. not only north, but also east and west. And, they reach our area reliably every year. And, it's probably how the monarch migration got started. Like if you look back over, the millennia of time, monarchs are year round in Central America. So what probably happened is that, they moved up and were getting frozen back. But as soon as the first one successfully completed that migration, it became encoded in their genes. And I would not be at all surprised if we don't see, if we're around long enough to see it, more migratory behavior in some of these butterflies too.
Awesome, thank you. Shift to moths. We had a question of do you know what sorts of trees that the giant silk moths like to use? And this person included, so we can make sure to give them a soft landing, which is a great reference to the practice of including mid-story shrubs and trees. But yeah, what are your thoughts here?
It's a long list. So they are extremely polyphagous, which means they eat many things. Basically, monarchs only like milkweed. These guys will eat the forest. Off the top of my head, I know they love hickory and walnut and sweet gum. Many of them will feed on things like birch and cottonwood. If you look in any good field guide or a website like Bug Guide or something like that, we'll give you the full list. But it's extensive.
Awesome, thank you. Maybe similar answer of consult an online resource, but a question asker of what plants besides tomatoes do hornworm moths enjoy? If you could speak to this.
Yeah, so most people are familiar with the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm. If you've grown tomatoes, odds are very good that you have seen it. But there's 125-ish species of these, and each species has its own particular food plant. We were just talking about the silk moths that will eat just about anything, but most butterflies and moths are pretty picky eaters. So there are some where the preference is kind of for a whole family of plants, and that's the case with a lot of these hornworms. I know the question was exactly about exotic plants that they might eat. Is that right? So, like the tomato hornworm will eat many things in the tomato family. So it will also eat, chili peppers. It will also eat, native solanums like the horse nettle and things like that. But everyone kind of has their own likes and dislikes.
Great, thank you. We had one question from a master naturalist who wants to use UV lights to attract moths for identification and outreach. Do you know of a good resource to find the best timing to view moths throughout the year? Have you come across a resource like that?
I'm sorry, did you say the best timing?
Yeah, yes.
Well, I don't know that I would say there is a good. I guess the answer to that question depends on if there's certain kinds that they're really trying to see. If you're interested in looking for kind of the giant silkworm moths like the Luna moth, if that's really what you want to see, then you're looking for the high summer months of like June and July. Moth diversity is really high. Worldwide, there's about 18,000 species of butterfly. Worldwide, there's over 150,000 species of moth. So when you realize that, if you just want to see moth diversity, you should blacklight in March. You should blacklight in April. You should absolutely do it in every month of the year. You're going to see cool things. However, if you're really looking for some of these charismatic big species, really what you want to target is like probably late May, June, July, August, September. The real key though is not the time of year, but it's more the conditions. The absolute best nights for black lighting are when it's a new moon, so you don't have the full moon or even mostly full moon that's competing with your light, and your location. If you have your light facing a woodland, you're going to draw in things from out of that wood. So it's not so much the time of year, though, like for peak diversity, summer is going to be best. But you're going to see some crazy cool things. Like if you do this after it's warmed up in April or May, you're going to see some crazy cool things throughout the summer and some crazy cool things in fall. Mhm.
Great, thank you so much. So now we can shift to bees and how they pick their nesting habitat.
Mhm.
But to begin, we had a question of if there are species of bees that prefer certain ecosystems and habitats over others. And that is certainly true, but I was hoping that you could speak to the bees of the prairie versus bees that can be found in urban environments.
Mhm. Yeah, it's absolutely true. I don't have a lot of information off the top of my head about which species might prefer each area. Um, I know like Heather Holmes' book on bees would be probably a great resource for this person to purchase or check out from the library. It's fantastic. But absolutely, one reason that so many species are struggling is because their habitat is a pretty specific habitat. There are prairie specialists, there are glade specialists, there are, and then there are the ones that are more able to adapt to our urban environment. So some of the ones that are on the endangered species list or should be on the endangered species list are these habitat specialists. And a lot of them are like wetland specialists or prairie specialists, and those habitats are endangered themselves. Um, the key thing that most of them seem to be missing, though, is that habitat, nesting habitat, and just kind of a assurance that they won't be subjected to insecticides or herbicides or things like that. That's why, since this is the focus today was overwintering, we didn't really go into it, but you cannot guarantee that any insecticide you're using on your property is not going to also affect your pollinators. So like if you use it to control pests in your garden, even if you're being really careful, you are probably affecting pollinators. These chemicals are designed to kill insects, and they're ridiculously good at it. So just you have to be very cautious with that.
Absolutely, thank you. We had one question of if the presence of moles or voles in the yard, how does that interact with ground nesting bees, do you think? Could they be harmful? Could they be helpful?
Well, I have no data on that whatsoever. But whenever I get a question like this, I know that moles have been here as long as those bees have been here, and they have grown up together. They've co-evolved together. So my instinct would be to say that they can figure it out. I know for a lot of us, we tend to think of moles as problems because they can be damaging to plants and such. But my instinct would be to say that as far as the bees, they probably don't cause any more harm than any other predator might potentially do. I don't mean to just brush off the question. That's not it at all. But they're not a. I don't think they're an outlandish threat to them, or we probably would have seen effects. The threat is habitat loss. The threat is, loss of habitat. The threat is chemicals in the environment. And we can tell that's the threat because we're seeing these decline in the modern age when people have been bringing all this into the environment.
Thank you. We had one question on inquiring as to how prescribed birding affects ground nesting bees. We have a paper linked on our website that I'll make sure gets included in our follow-up email about how the diversity of ground nesting bees is affected by, or actually increased by prescribed burning, but could you share any thoughts you have on how prescribed burning interacts with underground nests?
Yeah, I mean, what I know is that the ground nesting bees are not at the surface. They are feet deep. And I've read no research papers about how prescribed burning affects ground nesting bees, but I would assume it affects them not at all and is going to benefit them because of all the benefits it has to the local plant diversity.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that perspective of just how deep they are. Yeah.
Mhm.
We have a few sort of miscellaneous questions and then we'll close out. The first of which is someone asking about the Chinese mantises.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that this is maybe just a general entomologist
Mhm.
question
Mhm.
to ask of you, but what should we be doing about those?
Yeah, the best advice I can give about those is that do not intentionally bring their egg cases into your environment. They are part of our ecosystem now. I doubt we will ever exterminate them. But there's no compelling reason to like purchase one of their egg cases, or if you find one on a walk, to bring it back home. What that is going to do is introduce a very aggressive, very effective predator into your naturescape. I have met people who say when they see one, they kill one. That's fine. I would say, are you 100% sure it was the Chinese mantis and not one of our natives? If you are 100% sure, then you can certainly kill it. But like I would also tell people, like if you see one in your yard, I don't think there's any reason to like think that of that as a crisis. You can certainly try to capture it or kill it and remove it. The best thing you can really do is to don't intentionally bring them home.
Great, thank you.
Mhm.
And I wanted to get at this point, and I apologize if this is, if you're repeating, if I'm making you repeat yourself, but just on ground nesting bees, do they move from, do they move from year to year, or
Mhm.
are the nests permanent?
Mhm. The nests are not exactly permanent. Like they won't. If the next generation female will have to redig the tunnels, but I believe in many cases they do prefer the same location. And I am absolutely certain for some species they do. We have a really interesting situation in the park area here. There's a colony of digger bees that has been using the same area for many, many summers in a row now, going back at least to like 2019. And it's a really, really cool phenomenon. I can't speak with any kind of authority to all the great diversity of bees that's out there, but I think in many cases they do return to the same area.
Ah, I love that. Thank you so much, Chris. That
Mhm.
covers the majority of the questions, and we'll do our best with our follow-up email tomorrow. But thank you so
Mhm.
much for your perspective. It's been a really great webinar. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
All right. Thank you for answering our questions, Chris. And Lily, thank you for your thoughtful facilitation as always. Before
Mhm.
we head off for today, I have a couple of announcements about upcoming events. We hope you'll join us for our next webinar on November 19th at 4 p.m. when we explore photos of prairie splendor with Bruce Schutte. In this MPF webinar, Bruce will share a selection of photos from his Missouri Prairie photo album and share stories about the tallgrass prairie ecosystem that we all hold dear. You'll be sure to learn new facts about Missouri's prairies. For more on MPF's prairies, visit moprairie.org. Next, keep an eye out for registration open for our first webinar of December on grassland lichens, which we'll be holding on December 3rd at 4 p.m. Additionally, we will be offering several short-eared owl hikes this winter, the first of which will be held on December 17th at 4:30 p.m. at Shawnee Trail Conservation Area. Registration is ongoing and it's open right now. These events and more can be registered for at our websites under the events tabs. While that concludes today's webinar, I do want to pivot over to Chris for any closing updates on his end.
I appreciate that. I just wanted to tell everybody that the Butterfly House does have a native plant sale, and we know the dates for 2026. It's April 25th and 26th. That is the last weekend in April of next year. We would like to invite everyone to come shop.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris, for sharing your update and for providing us with such an informative webinar today. Everybody who's joined us, have a great evening. Bye.